Lu Heng. I'm the CEO of LARUS Limited. We are one of the largest IP address leasing platform, and we lease IP addresses to over 60 countries worldwide. And it's been really a pleasure to be participating in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the subject today we're talking about is data sovereignty and cross-border regulations and how we navigate those complex matters within Asia. Let's take the first question. How are data sovereignty laws impacting the design and deployment of regional connectivity infrastructure, such as IXPs, data routes, and submarine cables?
Government always want to do what the government always wants, right? They want control, they want security, and they want order. And the basic of any data sovereignty law is we want data. We want data to be localized. The fundamental philosophy of this idea contradicts in certain degree of the very principle of the internet. We need to be interconnected. As a very fact of interconnection only takes milliseconds to transmitting data from one location to another, make it extremely difficult for companies, especially at a corporate level, to manage the data, because company doesn't have really law enforcement powers. We can't really tell our users, say, hey, you shouldn't send your data to a foreign website because your data belongs to this state and this nation. And especially with interconnect points, we're talking about terabytes exchanges per second, every single second. And at this level, to have the vision, well, the vision of the government, which basically what they want is the data be fully localized. But when you have a data exchange at terabytes per second, it's become a technical impossibility. And when something becomes a technical impossibility, the only way to really comply with those data localization law is complying a technicality side, which means that, okay, well, you say this data need to be stored there, I do this. The real question I think we should ask ourselves, especially for the policymaker and the regulator to ask themselves is, can we really keep this data local? You know, we have all sorts of policies. The cloud data need to be local, but it's the same data has been shared across a different website or different services users use all the time. So those data are somehow foreign anyway. So can we really achieve a data sovereignty from that point of view? I think that's worth a lot of discussion on that.
Yeah, I think you're raising a very interesting point. Many governments want to localize their data. They also want to protect their people with data privacy regulations. But those same people go and put all of their personal information onto websites, onto social media sites, and nobody can regulate that. They're doing it off their own will. So the government can't regulate them, even though they want to. It's not possible.
And just add one little point to that is the data sovereignty and the regulation of localization of data is applied at a corporate level. But as a company, we don't have power to tell user what to do. Exactly, you said, they give you data willingly. They give data to almost every website they sign into, every service they sign into, and most of those services to most of the nations they are foreign. So how we comply to a regulation require we localize the user data, which while the user giving to everybody else in the same time. It's a real dilemma here.
A lot of conversations are going on at the moment about how AI is going to be developed, and AI challenges this even more because you want to draw the knowledge pool, the language model from data from everywhere. So again, how do you restrict that? And governments are very concerned about protecting their people and protecting their national interests around AI and the misuse of AI. So it's a very complex problem that I don't think we've got close to resolving yet.
Exactly. The AI also creates another set of problems, which is China, US, especially these big AI models. They know everything now. Because they crawl the web, right? They get everything. So basically, do we really have data sovereignty anymore? Like, I'm pretty sure the Chinese AI company and American AI company already have data from every corner of the internet. What's much of a point aside from psychological point of view, the data stay local kind of psychological point of view. In practice, I'm pretty sure the American AI company and the Chinese AI company, they already have all the data on the internet anyway. For each of the individual users, they probably already submit their data to Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, all the services anyways. If the data is already shared across globally and crowd and stored and trained by those large cloud companies at the same time as the AI company, basically they are the same companies, they already shared and they already stored everywhere. Does that really warrant a point to have a data sovereign law while everything's already stored everywhere and copied everywhere and being trained everywhere?
We're all acknowledging the complexity behind this, certainly with our knowledge base at the moment, seems to be almost impossible to manage. But equally, governments are concerned, whether it's 2 points of view or 25 points of view, they're going to have to come together at some stage and agree how to do this. Can you see or can you envision a middle ground, a position that they might get to that they can find acceptable?
Well, obviously having any large number of governments agree on a single subject is difficult if not impossible, as history told us. And since the data is generally available everywhere and being copied everywhere, as I mentioned previously, I saw this data sovereignty point of view is more of a political move and to please the voters in most of the nations, rather than a practical, actual safeguards the data which being generated all the time. Because most of the data we've been generating across social media and platform are public. There are certain privacy data that subject to various leaks, but they are probably the only data the government can actually regulate. That's saying if any company want to collect data from my country, that you need to follow this kind of laws. That's basically what the GDPR says. Any EU citizen subject to the protection of that. But then the question of such wide applicable law, can government really enforce it? Let's say if a European go to a website hosted in US or in China, and he's willing to give up his personal data to that Chinese or American provider, and those two providers they don't operate in Europe and they don't follow GDPR. What sanction European Union can actually apply to that single case? And if you multiply that by millions of times across, terabytes of data we're talking about from the exchange point, it will be almost impossible to practically enforce such law while they already put that in writing. But if you have a law which is written but you can't really enforce it, then come to the other philosophy question, then it's just comforting people psychologically. It doesn't really do anything.
Just thinking now a bit more about sort of the telco industry itself. I mean, there's a lot of competition out there amongst the regional players. Do you think that there is an increased appetite amongst telcos and maybe even particularly cloud providers to collaborate more on regional peering? Or is competitive and regulatory pressure just keeping them separated?
I think rather less intentional results of those data protection laws. From my point of view, from practical point of view, is they don't really protect data. As I said, the data has been mining all over anyway, but they do drive the local data center buildings and local data center economies, which is in a sense not a bad thing. Because of passing those data protection laws everywhere, and then we saw the large cloud providers and the large content providers are forced to building data centers in countries and in places that they normally wouldn't be doing that. And that creates a huge development opportunities for the local industry, as well as, in a way, equalize the digital gap between the developed world. Because technically, a lot of services can be centralized in one or two places in the world by those very large cloud companies, but now they're forced to pass on that knowledge and pass on that infrastructure to a less developed places where they were forced to store the data. Well, does that really help protect of those data stay locally? Probably not, but the data center is there. They at least need to show that they actually built it, and just because of that, I think in a way bridge the digital gap in a way the policymaker doesn't really envision originally. I think in terms of local investment opportunities, that data protection law does spike that, as I just mentioned, that it's an unintended consequence, but it's in a way further the decentralization of the internet and prevent data center being concentrated in one place. The data is mined everywhere anyway. And I want to point of view, because I run an IP address leasing company, but the transmitting and authorization of IP address is centralized in this region in Australia. The authentication for the IP address you identify on the internet is centralized in one company in Brisbane at this point. So transmitting of the data in real time can be break down at any time by that Australian company, which means we need to decentralize the internet to have things more equalized across the region, not necessarily just for the data protection, but also very much for the data transfer in the real time, the authentication of the internet, as well as how you transfer data from one place to another, who authenticated, and we get away from a centralization, both for the identifiers as well as from the cloud perspective, a large content provider put all the data in one place, mostly their home country or near interconnection point. It's not necessary for us if there are certain geopolitical changes, treaties, and wars. So a local data protection law, while it might not achieve its intended purpose of actually have the data stay locally and not be transmitted elsewhere, but it does further and create massive amount of investment opportunities for companies in less developed places and for markets where they were originally have no hope to having their own services provided locally. And I think that's actually a very good thing for all the companies and industrial players.
We're coming to the end of the panel session now, and I just wondered whether anybody in the audience had a question they'd like to ask.
My question really is around, we're talking about data sovereignty, we look at it in terms of paranoia and governance, but actually, the three biggest holders of data are three American companies. You talk about decentralization versus centralization. So I think there's a problem with that, but a problem then definition of what data do we want to keep in context. Not all, to your point earlier. We started off with the German rule, the European rule, but they decided to protect the data. But I do think that it's a confusion over government approach, national security, and then just general personal management. And the three big companies. Do you see that as being the driver behind the data sovereignty? Do you think they could provide solutions? Three big companies handle most of the data, they could protect it.
What I see is from your question is come down to one key aspect of it. Who can access the data locally? Is the government or a local corporation can access those data, or the guy in Silicon Valley or the guy in Shenzhen? If the local person be able to access the data, then in case of some massive destruction, then the local company theoretically be able to rebuild the service locally at its entirety. Let's say if the entire, United States disappears, if Facebook have the data locally, then it's not that hard to rebuild a Facebook service locally if someone locally have access. So that empowers decentralization of the internet, that we are no longer centralized. Yes, legally, from today's framework, it is centralizing three big players. But if the data protection law requires local access, a secondary access than was it from the main corporate office, then we might have a true decentralized internet where if the corporate office go away somehow, we can rebuild the service locally, because it shouldn't be too difficult with all the data available locally. And that is an unintended consequence, but in my personal view, it's a very good consequence. Thank you.
Thank you all.